like to share with you something that it took me 30 years to believe. 30 years and a couple hundred studies from all over the world. I'm a scientist, so it was kind of a hard sell. What if, in creating the modern world, we've been making an important mistake? What if we're missing an important ingredient in a healthy human habitat? I believe that most of us, most of the time, are suffering from nature deficit disorder. Now, that's kind of a radical idea, right? I mean, do you feel like you're in deficit? Does the CDC have a minimum daily requirement of nature? No. Right now, currently, nature is viewed as a treat. And as such, if you can afford it, great, it's very yummy. But if you can't, it's no big deal. And in fact, if you can afford it, it's not clear you shouldn't spend your money on other things, right? And as a consequence, we routinely destroy places like these. And we routinely make places like these. That's a school, not a prison. And it won an award for design. I have come to believe that places like these are importantly wrong. The great biologist E.O. Wilson tells us that humanity is a biological species living in a biological environment, and that like all species, we are exquisitely adapted to the environments in which we evolved. If you look at human evolution from the time that we first got really good at tools, about 2.5 million years ago, and you fast forward to the present, for almost that entire time, we are finding shelter wherever we can. We're on a kind of all-century, all-millennia camping trip. And it's only in the very last bit of time that we actually move into settlements. So what does this have to do with modern life? So we live differently as a species now than we used to live. Probably you're thinking, but I like indoor plumbing, right? Surely what we have now is better. But let's look again at the way human evolution went. So here's human evolutionary history from the Stone Age to the present. And that little sliver is the time we've been in settlements. So here we have been in all these different environments, mountains, coasts, forests, all this time, different environments, but for the vast majority of that time, no matter what kind of wilderness it was, we were in daily contact with nature. Has this marked us? I would contend that it does. Some of you may remember, I remember, zoos in the old days. Zoos were basically just long lines of cages. The mountain lion cage, the wildebeest cage, the bear cage, etc. And in those cages, animals received everything that we thought they needed. We gave them shelter, water, all the monkey chow they could want. And yet, the animals were dying at a pretty good clip. Sometimes faster than they would die out in the wild, where their needs were not being met. And this was both puzzling and very expensive for the zoos. So zoos experimented. They experimented a lot with how they would house their animals. And finally, eventually, they discovered a secret, which is that if you house an animal in a habitat which is most similar to the environment in which they evolved, their ancestral habitat, they do better. So now, when we go to a zoo, all we can see is ancestral habitats. Mommy, where's the giraffe? Oh, I think it's back there, behind the... No. So animals do best in the environments in which they evolved. In fact, organisms in unfit habitats undergo social, psychological, and physical breakdown. If humans evolved in daily contact with nature, then is an environment in which we are not in daily contact with nature going to cause social, psychological, and physical breakdown? If it does, perhaps we are not at our best. Perhaps we are undergoing social, psychological, and physical breakdown, even if we're used to it, even if we feel we're fine. So let's take a look at the evidence. One of the things that happens when you house animals in unfit habitats, say overcrowded cages, is you get a lot of aggression. More aggression than you might see in the wild or in more fit habitats. Might that be true of humans? How would we find out, short of putting people in cages and assigning them to more and less nature? Well, it turns out that Chicago Public Housing is a ready-made, grand-scale experiment in the effects of nature on people. You have lots and lots of architecturally identical buildings, and some of them have a little greenery around them, some of them have less. And most importantly, people are randomly assigned through sheer chance to different buildings. So there's no reason to expect any differences between the folks who end up in greener buildings and the folks who end up in less green buildings. Sheer chance. So we sent expert interviewers into Chicago Public Housing to lots and lots of different buildings to have them ask how residents handled different kinds of conflicts. And what we found is that, sure enough, in greener buildings, residents were systematically likely to report a better handling of arguments. They were more likely to use positive techniques in handling an argument, such as discussing something calmly or getting a third opinion. Less likely to raise their voice, to threaten someone, to threaten to use a knife or gun, to use a knife or gun. That's kind of an amazing finding, and we were kind of, frankly, skeptical. That's kind of our job. So we're skeptical, and we say, okay, how can we check if this is true? Well, we asked the Chicago police to please share with us their crime reports for Chicago Public Housing. And lo and behold, we found that in Chicago's police crime reports, we find the exact same pattern. The greener buildings had fewer violent crimes. That finding has now been replicated in many places with many populations. And not only that, extended. So now, we've seen a whole series of studies, dozens of studies, showing that when you have access to nature, you have better outcomes. So the list below, the second list, are good outcomes, and those are promoted by access with nature. And the list above are bad outcomes, and those are promoted by nature deficits. Those are pretty serious outcomes, I hope you'll agree. Psychological breakdown. ADHD is one of the most common neurobiological disorders, and it's especially common in children. So if you have a classroom with 30 kids in it, you're expecting 3 kids with ADHD, or 3.3 kids. We took a bunch of kids with ADHD on forced marches for 20 minutes through different settings. 20 minutes in a park, and then a week later, 20 minutes in a nice residential area that was less green, and another week later, 20 minutes in downtown. Not all the kids did the walks in those orders. But the point is, after they did each of these walks, we would take them indoors, and another experimenter would test their concentration. And the other experimenter didn't know which walk they had been on. That was really important. What did we find? We found that Johnny performed substantially better in their concentration after the park walk than after the other 2 walks. And furthermore, the size of this boost, this difference, was the same size as the peak effect for methylphenidate, also known as Ritalin. We don't know how long it lasts, but it seemed like a pretty intriguing finding, so we followed up with a national study. We asked parents all over the US to tell us how their kids' symptoms were after activities conducted in different settings. So for instance, basketball in an indoor setting, or basketball in a green outdoor setting. What happens? What happens to your kid after these activities in these settings? And lo and behold, it turns out that parents tell us systematically their kids' symptoms are better after activities in green outdoor settings. And this is true for kids from 5 years old to 18, living all over the US, Bar Harbor to Albuquerque, inner city Detroit, to the suburbs of Washington, DC. So that's ADHD. Contact with nature improves ADHD. What about depression? Depression is one of the most common neurological problems in adults. It causes tremendous levels of disability, and it's a major problem in this country. When you look at the amount of greenness around a person's home, it turns out you can start to predict their levels of depression. If they don't have clinical depression, you can predict their depressive symptoms, signs of depression, starting signs of depression. And furthermore, you can predict the rate of clinical depression in the population. More green, less depressive signs, less clinical depression. This is work that's been conducted in the Netherlands in over 345,000 people, and in Wisconsin. So you know that it's true not only for people, but for cheeseheads. Yet another study conducted in London looked at pharmacies that served catchment areas that were either greener or less green, and that had comparable income. And they found that if you looked at pharmacies in greener neighborhoods, they tended to dispense fewer mood-related medications. So you're seeing this actual difference in healthcare needs as a result of this difference in symptomatology. That translates to a whole series of other findings or effects. So again, the mental and psychological disorders in the top list are things that we are protected against if we have contact with nature. And the items in the list below are things that are promoted by contact with nature. You're better, smarter, kinder, gentler. Physical breakdown. Cardiovascular disease involves things like heart attacks, stroke, high blood pressure. It's incredibly common. In fact, heart attacks are the leading killer in the US, and we spend roughly $300 billion a year on cardiovascular issues alone. Does this have to be? It turns out that a walk in the woods makes a substantial difference in your cardiovascular profile in your blood. So let's say you and I go for a walk in Acadia, and I bring a syringe. We walk along, and after a while, there's a good stopping point, and I take your blood, and I analyze it. If I analyze your blood after you've walked in the woods for a while, I will find more good chemicals, more adiponectin, which fights against atherosclerosis, and more DHEA, which fights against heart disease. And I'll find fewer negative chemicals, bad chemicals. There's a whole host of chemicals associated with high blood pressure that drop when you go for a walk in the woods. Again, a walk in the urban setting doesn't do anything for you. That's just the way it is. I'm sorry. So this walk in the woods significantly changes your cardiovascular health profile for that moment. Okay, that's great, but what if we can't get to the woods? Well, it turns out that a green neighborhood cultivates cardiovascular health. In a green neighborhood, people are less likely to have high blood pressure, In a green neighborhood, people are less likely to have cardiovascular disease. In a green neighborhood, people are less likely to die from cardiovascular disease. And in a green neighborhood, if you get a stroke, you're more likely to survive it. So it's building not only cardiovascular health, but also cardiovascular resilience. And that, again, is just the tip of the iceberg. Again, many, many negative outcomes are associated with inadequate access to nature, nature deficits. And the second list is good things. Trust me, adiponectin is a good thing, that are associated with having more access to nature. But I want to just talk about a few items in the list above. Diabetes and obesity. Contact with nature reduces diabetes. This is serious business. Diabetes is the 7th leading killer in the US, and its complications include blindness, heart disease, kidney failure, and amputations. So when nature protects against diabetes, that's kind of a big deal. Similarly, obesity is a major problem in this country and other developed countries, and nature seems to protect against that as well. 10 studies out of 10. So all of this evidence, which I'm only just really giving you the tiniest taste of, suggests that nature is kind of like a vitamin. It helps us, it promotes our strength in many ways, and it protects us against many bad things. So I believe that someday the CDC will actually have a minimum daily requirement for vitamin N, which raises a question. How much vitamin N should we take? And I have 3 answers to that. Big doses have big effects. This shows 2 natural killer cells. They're white blood cells, but for some reason they're yellow in this picture. They're white blood cells that seek out cancerous cells and infected cells. They're the kind of the vigilantes of the immune system. So these natural killer cells above are attacking a cancer cell right now. When they find one, they lob onto it and extrude toxic granules, which then explode the cell. How cool is that? So if you have a good supply of these, it's very protective against cancer. People who have a good supply of natural killer cells are 40% less likely to get cancer over an 11-year window, okay? And the 40% less likely to get cancer compared to people who have a low supply of natural killer cells. Okay, now what? Well, if I take you on a 3-day weekend in a natural area, it boosts your natural killer cells by a lot. How much? 50%. 50%. And a month later, if I come back and take your blood again, which is apparently something I like to do, suddenly, although your natural killer supply is down from where it first started immediately after the visit, it's still 23% above baseline, above where you started. 3-day weekend, 30 days later, still a 23% increase in natural killer cells. So big doses have big effects, big, important, lasting effects. And what that means is, when we fight to save Acadia and beautiful lands like that, we are not just protecting our natural resources, we're protecting a major health resource. And when you take the time to go to one of these places for the weekend, you are not just having a treat. You are doing something that's really good for you. You are investing in your future health. It's almost as if scientists were telling us that bacon was as good for us as broccoli. You're welcome. So in the face of that, you might be thinking, well, the everyday doses of nature, the little tiny bits of nature that you might have, of nature experience that you might have in your everyday life, those probably don't count for much, right? driving home along a parkway after work instead of a concrete artery, or washing dishes at the kitchen window with a green view. Is that just a pleasant experience, or does that actually buy you something? Well, it turns out that even these teeny tiny doses have real impacts, measurable impacts. So playing with soil for just 5 minutes is enough to flip your nervous system from fight or flight response to the exact opposite. If you care, it's parasympathetic nervous activity and vagal tone. So can 5 minutes of looking at pictures of nature. The smell of roses reduces the stress hormone cortisol in your blood. So these tiny, tiny little doses have real effects. And what's really great is they seem to have cumulative effects. In other words, if you invest in these tiny little doses in your day, and you get a few of them, then you're going to get a cumulative impact. And as a consequence, everyday doses which occur every day, everyday doses have huge effects. Consider street trees. And I hope you have street trees in your neighborhood. As you just saw, street trees contribute to lower levels of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. That's so 5 minutes ago. Okay, fine. But how big of an effect? How much better is it to have street trees around? A study in Toronto with over 2.2 million people calculated the effect for cardiometabolic disorders. And what they found is that to get the same increase of in cardiometabolic health from 11, that you would get from 11 street trees more on a block, on a city block, you would have to give everyone in the neighborhood, not just the block, $20,000 more annually, or make everyone 1.4 years younger. So we could either shell out the money to plant 11 trees, not just 10, 11 trees on a block, or we could give $20,000 a year more to all the households in that neighborhood, or we could turn back time. What is the cost of 11 street trees compared to the healthcare costs that we're saving by planting them? What would be the healthcare savings if we routinely provided greener neighborhoods for everyone, rich and poor? Which brings us to a final point. You can see poverty from space. This is Chicago. Green is rich, not green is poor. That pattern is visible in satellite imagery from all over the US and all over the world. Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Munich, Berlin, Beijing. Everywhere you go in the world, this is a general pattern. It's not always true, which is very helpful for me, but it's generally true. And what are the ramifications of that? If rich is green and poor is not, then how much of the difference in health that's enjoyed by rich people versus poor people is actually due to their daily contact with nature? Some folks in the UK went to study this. They rounded up mortality records for 40 million people. And what did they find? Well, rich people die at a much slower clip than poor people. Okay, we knew that. We already knew that. Okay, guys. But when you when you look just at people who live in the same levels of greenness, who have the same levels of neighborhood greenness, then suddenly the difference between rich and poor is cut in half. In half. So that means that by greening neighborhoods, we may be reducing the number of preventable deaths by 1/2. So science is telling us that when we create places like these, they're importantly wrong. Nature is an essential component of a healthy human habitat, and addressing nature deficits is just as important as the $300 billion we spend on cardiovascular disease a year. It's just as important as preventing amputations and heart disease and kidney failure. It's just as important as addressing the injustice of all those completely avoidable illnesses and diseases. Finally, science is telling us that when we fight fiercely to protect places like these, we are not just preserving gems that our previous generations have handed down to us so that we can hand them down to future generations. We are preserving ourselves. Thank you.